So today we're going to be talking about valuing your law practice. A lot of attorneys come to me and have this initial assumption that they're just going to value their practice based off the last year's gross revenue. And that's probably a poor way to go about valuing your law practice. If you want to make the most out of your law practice, or more importantly, want to understand how you can best value the law practice, this video is going to go over some of the reasons that a retiring attorney would want to value it, why a growing firm would want to talk about valuing their practice, or a solo practitioner would want to go about valuing their practice. Each one of them has a different reason to do so, but in some ways they all tie in together just a little bit. There are 5 different ways to value your practice, and each practice, I don't want to say each practice uses a different valuation. There's 2 or 3 that pretty much everybody kind of defaults to. And a lot of people just default to some multiple of their annual cash flow. But that's not the only way to value a practice. And some practices actually find a better valuation when they go through and take the time to go through and actually have the valuation done. It's also important to have a valuation done by a third party so that if the DOL, IRS, whoever came around and said, well, how did you come to this number? You can go, someone told me this is how much. And you can say, and really ideally the person who tells you should have like, hey, here's 5 ways that we valued it. And then you say, and out of the 5, I picked this one. And the reason we chose this one was because of XYZ. I think a lot of attorneys would be surprised by the value of their practice. Next part to that too is once you know the value of your practice and how that value is created, you know how to increase it better. Like, look, if it's everything's just straight up gross cash flow, then cutting costs doesn't really help you increase the value of your practice. You need more cases, right? If it's all about just the gross dollars coming in, it's all about increasing the gross dollars coming in, not about cutting costs. Whereas if you are valuing your practice based off net income, now all of a sudden it's bringing in cases, but also holding down costs. Each law firm is going to be different in how they attack that particular number. You may find that, hey, we're a couple years away from selling the practice. I no longer want to do X because it negatively affects the value of the practice. If I'm selling it to, I want to be able to say, look, this is how I value my practice, blah, 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 blah. Here's the value. Here's the valuation, people. And everybody knows quickly, okay, I want to do this. Or you're sending the practice over to the next generation. And you're like, hey, here's what you're buying. Here's how we value it. And then okay, and my job now is to build up, hold down, do X, Y, Z to maximize the value of the practice to me. But my point being is like, you don't know that until you know how you've decided to value your practice.
Awesome. Love it. Such a great topic. So for which scenarios do you want evaluation in total? So of course, when you sell it at the end of your career, but let's say you are in the middle of your career, you're in your 40s, things are booming. Why should you bother with valuing your practice?
This is for anyone who has partners, anybody who has partners. It's also for anybody who wants to prepare for the unforeseen. So if you are a sole practice, and you are worried like, hey, if I die or if I get disabled, like, what are we doing? What am I doing? What's my family doing if I die or get disabled? Well, any insurance company that you go to get life insurance, disability insurance is going to say, okay, well, why are we insuring you for so much money? Yeah, I have a law practice. Oh, well, what's the value of the law practice? Remember, the insurance companies aren't experts in the valuation of your business. They're just insurance experts. And so you have to go to them and say, hey, here's an insurable need I have. And you have to be able to prove that you have that need. Some needs are very evident, like I have a job that pays me $120,000 a year. I need $1.2 million of life insurance. And they're like, okay, that sounds good to us. And then all they're looking for is a W-2. And you're like, here's my W-2. They're like, fantastic, you're insured now. The other side, but on a business, it's much, there's more to it. So they're like, well, we don't understand this quite as well. And so you go to them. If you have a business partner, then you want to make sure that your family knows how to value the practice, because not to say we all know that there's partners out there and the partners are out there for themselves. Not to say that's your partner, but better to have a clear delineation. Good fences make good neighbors, right? Same thing there. Good agreements make good partners. If everybody knows what the rules are, hey, that helps us perform better and it helps us know, hey, this is what I expected of me. Here's if something happens, here's what happens. And you want those rules set out clearly. And it's funny how attorneys, they tend to everyone else's gardens and forget, hey, don't forget to tend to your own, right? You're going through, and your life is about interpreting rules and setting down clear guidelines for people and contracts. Don't forget to do the same thing for yourself. And often attorneys fall into the mistake of, well, my partner's an attorney. He knows what the rules are. His rules or his interpretation of the rules may be slightly askew from yours. And if that's the case, oh, that's where problems arise, and lawsuits and dilemma and heartache. And if you pass away or get disabled and your family's like, hey, we think the practice is worth like $22 million. The other partner's like, how about 6? That's going to cause a problem.
Yeah.
And that all could have been resolved if someone had just taken 3 or 4 hours and put their stuff in order and, taken the time to protect themselves and fund everything. So that is why you want a business valuation.
Perfect. Before you said something about, so there was like gross cash flow versus net. Isn't there like a more, let's say, a unified way, like a more standard way of valuing a law practice? It sounds like a very big difference between gross and net, and basing the valuation off of that, because if you're very unprofitable, if you're spending money up the wazoo, it's of course not as valuable, is it?
Yeah.
So which one is it?
There's 5 ways to value a practice. So there's not, and it's typically every practice is like, okay, here's the 5 ways. Well, you may want to take the most valuable of the 5 options. You may want to take the least valuable of the 5 options, depending on how you want to go after taxes. Or you may look at the least valuable option and say, I know that's the least valuable right now, but I know what I'm doing, and I know that's going to be the most valuable. And then our job is to go through and say, okay, we chose this, and then to write a quick narrative to say, hey, the reason we chose this valuation is for XYZ purposes. And so you're right. There is a standardized way. Well, the problem is that there's not one standardized way. There's 5 standardized ways to go through it. And so we just get an appraiser. Actually, in our case, we use an insurance company called Principal, who will give us the valuation, no cost to the attorney. And they just want the ability to bid. If there's insurance need, they just get an opportunity to bid the insurance need. And so that's what we do, is we go to Principal and say, look, they ask for a list of data points. We give it to them. They come back with the 5 valuations, and for that, they get the right to bid on the insurance.
Perfect. And this document with the 5 valuations then serves as the source for that you can then take to any insurance company that do the and so on, like anything
Correct.
that where you might need it, so you don't have to rely on your own assessment.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Okay.
And it's something that hopefully you keep with your buy sell or your stock purchase plan, whatever it is you have, you keep it with that documentation. So that everybody ever questions, why did we value the practice at this? You go, ba-ching, this reason. And now we think it's worth more or less or whatever based on this document. I mean, honestly, I find that probably about 75% of the attorneys I meet just assume that they're going to get one time their annual gross. And I'm like, well, why that number? And it's kind of like, they're like, well, what else would we do? I'm like, well, there's 5 different ways to do this. And they're like, there are? And so it's taking the time to just get somebody to value it and to say, okay, look, here is the best valuation for you. That wasn't even the best one. This is the best one. Or that is the best one. But we think if you do this, you could be worth more in 3 years. Hey, great. And that's why there's different. The reason to do it is it's different for each attorney. For the partners, okay, it's obvious, because if they need to get a buyout or, there's a tragedy occurs, they need to have the clear fence line. If it's for someone about to retire in the next 5, 10, 3, 2, 1 years, I mean, obviously you want someone to buy your practice. If you're the sole prop, I would say that's the hardest reason to see, why am I doing this? A good reason to do it as a sole prop is, imagine you have other sole props, you have other businesses around you. One of the things I like to do is I like to go to bigger firms and say, hey, I got an idea. You want to potentially grow the practice through acquiring other firms? Yeah. I was like, what if you just went to these attorneys and said, hey, if you ever decide to merge your practice, we want to be the people that you work with. But we recognize that right now you want to be a sole prop, you want to do things on your own. How about we get some life insurance on you? And at the very least, if something happened to you, we would be able to pay out your estate and we would be able to take over your book of cases. And the other thing we're asking for is like, if you ever choose to merge, you give us some preferential treatment and just say, hey, you guys have been good to me. If you have someone else offer and you're like, I'm going to buy, just come to us and say, hey, here's what they're offering. Can you match it? Give us the ability to match or do whatever you're going to do if you're going to grow in. But then the big firm gets first right of refusal, kind of that preferential treatment. The little guy gets some coverage and protection for his family that he can use. It seems like a good win-win for everybody. Some cheap insurance for the little guy and a chance to grow for the big guy. Good.
Did we cover sufficiently why the growing law practice might want to do it?
Yeah. So okay. A growing law practice, a lot of growing law practices either have one primary equity partner or have multiple equity partners. If you have multiple equity partners and you're a growing practice, look, the reason's obvious. You have other partners, and if something happens to you, you want to make sure that your family gets the value that they're due for the practice. If you don't have that delineated, you're kind of leaving all these attorneys to guess at what they'd like to buy the practice at from your family. And your family's there trying to figure out, how do I value a law practice, right? You have one party, a whole bunch of attorneys with all the data. And then you have your family with no data who has no idea how to value practices. Who's going to win in that negotiation? Probably not your family, right? If you have one major partner and a whole bunch of minor attorneys. Oh, so the other thing I've seen about a growing practice is most of them have more than one attorney. There are unique examples where you have one attorney. If you are a firm with one attorney that is growing rapidly, you definitely need a valuation system, because you're going to need to, if something happens to that attorney, and you're going to need to replace them post haste. You're going to need to figure out what to do. And remember, if you don't care about your staff, I mean, that's one thing. But if you do care about your staff, you want to make sure that your staff, if they get subsumed by another big firm, or you have an attorney that jumps in and takes over the book, the cases, you need to make sure that the value is there, one, for your family. But then I'd also recommend, if you care about your staff, make sure you're protecting your staff, right? If someone's going to let go, it's not going to be the new attorney's staff. It's going to be your staff that gets let go, right? Even if they're, super adept and everything, you have an attorney that doesn't quite know what's going on. It's good to have cash to be able to say to the new attorney coming on, because your staff's going to have relationship with other attorneys. It's good to be able to say to the new attorney, hey, don't worry. The business now has the cash necessary to continue operations. You just need the attorney that, oversees the cases and does all the work that has to be done by attorneys. So there's a couple. Growing firms can kind of range from multiple partners to one attorney, but each one of them has essentially the same level of conundrum. It's, how do we maintain the value of the practice?
These 5 valuation methods, how disparate are they? So let's say a law firm has 10 million in revenue. And maybe whatever, I don't know what would be appropriate profit, let's say 5 million in profit. Service business, so it's going to be 5 million profit. Do you know how wide-ranging the valuations can be given those 5 methods?
Gigantic. They can be huge. You can have one valuation that says, oh, this practice is worth $22 million. And you can have one that says, hey, this practice is worth $2 million. Then you can also have the valuations be super tight. If the valuations are super tight, nice. You got your answer, because all the valuations basically point to relatively the same thing. Okay. If they're super far apart, that is the ideal reason to have the valuation. It's so funny how, one, if all the numbers are close, you want the valuation because you're like, yay, I was right. If they're super far apart, that is where the IRS DOL could come to you and say, we don't understand the valuation of this. That valuation will initially, at some point, drive a transfer of assets, right? Either to when you're retiring, or if you sell the practice, or if you, whatever, right? There's going to be some reason that valuation could be challenged. And you want to be able to have the document that says, look, we got this huge spread of values, and we chose this value out of the 5. It's a third party that did the valuations. The reason we chose this value was XYZ. And that's a moment where you're kind of covering yourself and saying, hey, I did the homework necessary. I made the choice. And the IRS kind of loses a lot of their footing if you made a reasonable choice, documented it, and can prove like, hey, this is a reasonable choice for these reasons.